we'll go from there. So again, thank you for having me. I want to start by saying, I've been waiting to give this talk for a long time, for a really, really long time. In fact, I've been waiting to give this talk for about 9 months, 15 days, and 22 hours. And that's because it was on March 5th that we were sitting in our conference room about 2 p.m. that we heard the first case of COVID had hit Summit. And suddenly the reality set in at that moment that this was really going to happen. And so since that moment, I've been thinking about how vaccines could be our solution. So I'm gonna share my screen, hopefully, and get the PowerPoint going. So let me make sure that we can all see that. Stacy, is that coming through okay?
Yep, thank you.
All right. So like I said, it's been a long time that I've been waiting to give this talk. And it's a privilege to be here with the community. But I think it's also an opportunity to take a moment and reflect. And it has been a long road. In fact, it's been a really, really long road. I think this road is probably truly more reflective of the course that we've been on, ups and downs, curves, going in sometimes no direction. And as we look back, it was just about a little over a year ago that some of us started to see headlines like this: killer virus now spreading fast. And we remember this gentleman. This is a Chinese scientist who tried to alert the world to COVID. He in fact passed away from COVID soon afterwards. The pandemic progressed and the reality started to set in. San Francisco issued a stay-at-home order and it started to get a little bit scary. Suddenly our streets were empty, people were stuck at home, hospitals got overwhelmed, hospitals got set up in other facilities so that we could take care of excessive number of patients. Our schools closed, kids stopped having the opportunities that they normally had. And we saw pictures like this, people really sick, crowded hospitals on breathing machines, and even pictures like this where we just could not keep up. It was a tough time. It has been a tough time. It affected us all, even if we're not in healthcare. We remember pictures like this. This was probably the toilet paper aisle, as you recall. This was our summer of baseball. We all got replaced by cardboard cutouts and had to watch from home. Some of us ran out of personal protective equipment and we had to make do. Some responded to that problem and we came together and started making masks. Some people donated items. Some of you donated items and helped us out. We had issues with testing. Testing was not easy. This crisis came with controversy, lots of controversy. It has not been easy. It has mostly just been really, really hard for everybody. But fortunately, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that's why we're here today to talk about vaccines for COVID. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why we need you. We're going to spend some time reviewing some basic immunology. We'll talk a little bit about what was called Operation Warp Speed. We'll talk about vaccine efficacy, vaccine safety, and ultimately the plan. So we need you. I know a lot of you on this call are frontline responders, healthcare personnel, maybe teachers, and we need all of you. Why do we need all of you? This reflects vaccine acceptance by month throughout the pandemic if a COVID-19 vaccine were to be made available. And what you can see is in March, it started off fairly high and it's slowly dwindled over time. And so vaccine acceptance across the nation is somewhere between 60 and 70%. And this vaccine hesitance affects all ethnicities and all races. You can see the difference between African Americans, Hispanics, whites, Asians here on this graph. And the vaccine hesitancy even affects healthcare providers. Even nurses and physicians have some hesitance on this vaccine. And so it's very important that we have this conversation and this discussion so that we can restore the confidence and have good communication. Strong science is a necessary starting point, and healthcare professionals' confidence in and commitment to the vaccine is an essential starting point. Trust in the process is paramount. We will be faced with distractors, as you could see in the right lower corner there. Some people are even starting to undermine this confidence in this vaccine. And so we have to have vaccination with confidence. And so this is a moment to pause and think about, no matter who you are on this call, no matter where you work, you all have a job. You need to go out there and restore the confidence in the vaccine that is being administered. And that's why we are here today. It doesn't matter what happens in New York or San Francisco, we control what happens here. And we can put an end to this pandemic. We can restore the ability to go with our families, to meet with our friends, to get back to normal if we embrace this vaccine. And so we all need you to take this as a pledge to improve and help our community. So I'm going to go on, and I can't talk about vaccines if I don't review some basic immunology. And this is an important part about how bacteria and viruses affect our immune system and how our immune system responds. So this is a virus, and all viruses are similar. They have an internal genetic code. A lot of them are made up of RNA, and they basically create a structure that encapsulates this genetic material. And the entire goal of a virus is basically to replicate itself. It just wants to make more. That's all it does. And so we have an immune system. And in our immune system, we have these things called antibodies. And we are born with 10 billion or so antibodies that can attach to basically every unique structure that is not ourselves. And so we're born with a very, very sophisticated immune system that's ready to respond to every structure out there that is not ourselves. Each antibody reacts to its own unique structure. So this antibody responds to this structure, but it won't respond to the other structures. So what happens when we normally get an infection? When we normally get an infection, we talked about how viruses or bacteria have a unique structure, and the schematic here represents that. This star represents a virus or a bacteria. And if our immune system with these antibodies runs into this virus, if it doesn't match, as you can see here, it won't bind. But if it does match, as you can see here, it creates an immune response. And when it binds, this immune response triggers our immune system to activate. It signals other immune system cells that come in and kill this virus, and not only kill this virus, but cause us to make a whole bunch more of these antibodies so that if we ever see this virus again, we are more than prepared to suppress it and attack it before it has a time to multiply. Now, a very important part about natural immunity is when we have an immune response and we have that chemical signal that signals that immune response, we call in all these chemicals and helper cells that help our body react. And in fact, the redness, the inflammation, even the fever comes not from the virus or the bacteria, but comes from our sophisticated immune response that is developed over time to fight these infections. So fever comes from your body's response to an infection, and not from the infection itself. Fever is a way for our body to gain an upper hand on fighting an infection because viruses and bacteria aren't smart enough to replicate at higher temperatures. So we purposely generate a fever to fight infections. And so it's very important to recognize our immune response and how that plays a role in natural infection. So this is COVID and how it acts when it attacks us. The virus enters the body through this ACE2 receptor, and this is the spike protein that we're talking about. And when it enters, it gets inside the cell, and then it takes this RNA, this genetic material that basically has a program to create more viruses, and basically it tells your body to create more viruses. And so it secretes more viruses, and that is what the virus does. Our body responds by taking this virus up and showing the parts of the virus to the immune system. And when it shows it, it stimulates these antibodies that will be secreted so that the antibodies can attack the COVID virus in the future. So that's basic COVID immunology 101. And so we know a lot about our immune system. We have something called our adaptive immunity that produces antibodies. And the most common way we develop antibodies is through the process I just described as an active infection. But there are other ways we develop antibodies. Some of them we may be familiar with since I'm a pediatrician. Moms pass a lot of antibodies onto their newborns, and that's in fact one of the reasons why newborns actually don't get sick that often. When you're very young, you actually don't get sick that often. Now, these antibodies passed on from mother to child don't last very long and eventually disappear. Another way to get antibodies is by delivery of a medication. And many of you have heard about in COVID, there's multiple antibodies. Our president, Trump, got an antibody when he got sick, and he got something called Regeneron. But there are other antibodies that are made in pharmaceuticals that we can administer IV. But the last way we can get antibodies is through active immunization. And that's a way to trick the body into producing antibodies without having to suffer through the infection. So there are many types of vaccines out there. There are live attenuated vaccines, and this is when you use a live virus to stimulate the immune system. There are inactivated or killed viruses. There are broken off pieces of viruses that help produce an antibody response, or there are toxoids. So let's talk about a few of these specific ones. One of the most common and most original types of vaccines are weakened viruses. And this is basically where you inject a live virus into a person that has been so weakened that it can't cause disease, but yet it is still able to trigger immune response, so you get the antibodies without having to suffer through the disease. An example of a weakened virus would be MMR, is a very common weakened virus or live virus vaccine. Inactivated viruses are when we chemically kill the virus so that it can no longer replicate, but we inject that. Some examples of chemically killed viruses are polio and flu. Flu is actually a killed virus that we inject in. It can't cause the flu because it's dead, but it still stimulates the immune response. Another type of virus or another type of vaccine we use are virus-like particle vaccines. And this is where we use a dead or empty virus, like a viral-like particle, like human papillomavirus or hepatitis V, to inject it, and again, to trick the immune system into creating antibodies. Sometimes we'll just break off a piece of the virus, and these are called protein subunit vaccines. And this is where you break off like a piece of the virus, like the hood ornament on a Mercedes-Benz. You break off just the hood ornament so you know it's a Mercedes-Benz, but there's no engine in this that can cause an infection. We inject these parts of a virus, but the immune system doesn't know. It just responds to it and creates immunity. Some examples of this type of vaccine are acellular pertussis vaccine, the type that we use in whooping cough. Another type of vaccine, and these are relatively new, are what we call a viral vector vaccine. And this is where you take an innocent virus, like an innocent adenovirus that doesn't cause human infection, and they inject some of the genetic material from the coronavirus into the genetic code of this other virus. And so that when you inject this and this virus gets taken by the immune system, it creates these little spike proteins because you injected the spike protein into the genetic material of this other virus. And this creates an immune response. This is the type of virus or the type of vaccine that is being generated by AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson that you'll be hearing more about probably in January of this year. Now, the vaccine we're talking about today is called an mRNA vaccine. And an mRNA vaccine is when you take just the genetic material for a small component of the COVID virus. So you're really just doing the genetic material for just the spike protein. That is it. There's nothing else here except the genetic material that codes for making a spike protein. An analogy might be just the manufacturing capability of the Mercedes-Benz logo, but nothing about the manufacturing ability of the engine, the wheels, the other parts that make a car run. So there's nothing in this but the genetic code for a spike protein. It's encased in a lipid or a fat, and this is injected. And because it's encased in a fat, it gets uptaken into our cells, and our cells then take this code and convert it into a protein, and then express this protein, and we get an immune response. So you cannot get COVID from this vaccine because there's nothing in it but a spike protein. Now, sometimes I hear about this is new technology. Well, this is one of the new mRNA vaccines, which we have not done before, but mRNA technology is not new at all. In fact, there's been decades and decades of research on mRNA technology in cancer therapy and other therapies and in vaccines. And in fact, when I did a National Library of Medicine research on mRNA vaccines that you can see here, I came up with 5,854 citations. So you can see that there's been extensive research. In fact, mRNA vaccine research first started in the year 1990, and that was the first study of mRNA. So that's 20 or 30 years ago. And just to put that in perspective for some of you who may not be the same age as me, we put everything on a parallel to cell phones. And so here's the cell phone that you were using in 1990. So if you think that is old technology, then you must think that mRNA is old technology. All right, time for Operation Warp Speed. We've all heard about it, we know about it, but what is it? Well, Operation Warp Speed is really quite simple. It is the government working together with private industry to remove barriers so that we get a successful, safe vaccine. That's it. So one of the things about Operation Warp Speed is they wanted to fund a variety of vaccine candidates based on different platforms. The government didn't want to put all its eggs in one basket. What happens if the first mRNA vaccine wasn't effective? They wanted to have multiple technologies out there available, and in fact, that's what's going on. So we have our first vaccines are mRNA, but our next ones will be viral vector, and the third set of vaccines to come out will be subunit protein vaccines. The other part about Operation Warp Speed is they wanted to make sure the vaccine development progressed without compromising safety, efficacy, meaning how well they work, or product quality. And so they wanted to make sure that they were able to support the pharmaceutical companies in funding very large phase 3 trials. They wanted to optimize these phase 3 trials and have no barriers to the quality and how large they were and how diverse they were. And the last part about Operation Warp Speed is they wanted to support the process so that if a vaccine were approved, it would be approved and the infrastructure to produce that vaccine would already be established. So they removed a lot of the financial risk to building facilities and equipment to make the vaccine prior to its approval, so that once it went through the normal approval process, we would be up and running and able to administer the vaccine. So this is a vaccine life cycle, and what you can see on the left side here is the basic research. And this has been going on, as I mentioned, for decades with mRNA vaccines. Then we went through the phase 1 process, which is safety. Phase 2 is effectiveness, where they look at antibody response. And phase 3 are these very large studies looking at the safety and effectiveness of vaccine. They then go to the FDA for review, then they go to the ACIP for review, and then they develop into phase 4, which they monitor the vaccines after they've been developed. Now, what I'm showing you here is the standard process for a licensing for a vaccine. You'll note that there were really no shortcuts done. We had the normal research done. We had a normal phase 1, we had a normal phase 2, normal phase 3. It went to the FDA, it went to the ACIP. So there were no shortcuts in the safety and the process of this vaccine development. So how did it go faster than normal? Well, what you can see here is the traditional, very linear vaccine development process, which has a lot of bureaucracy and phases in between. And what they did is they were able to compress and overlap some of these so that if we had a successful product that met all the safety and efficacy priorities, it could be delivered to people and stop this pandemic. So there were really no shortcuts. So when you develop a vaccine, you have to decide what is our endpoint. And when they developed this vaccine, they focused on the prevention of symptomatic disease. And they figured that if they could prove that we stop symptomatic disease, it would likely mean that we decreased intensive care admissions, likely prevent death, likely prevent transmission. And so their endpoint, their primary endpoint, was prevention of symptomatic disease. So as I mentioned, Operation Warp Speed has supported 6 vaccine products. You know about Pfizer and Moderna because they have met regulatory review process and approval. Our next ones that we'll be seeing are AstraZeneca and Janssen. And then later in the spring, we'll see Novavax and GlaxoSmithKline. So, big question. Does the vaccine work? And the answer to that is a resounding, amazing yes. Yes, it does work. So Pfizer vaccine showed a 95% efficacy at the prevention of symptomatic COVID infections. The Moderna vaccine showed a very similar 94.1 efficacy at the prevention of symptomatic COVID infections. So very, very effective. In fact, they were hoping that they would get to 50%, and that would be good enough because that would help shut down this pandemic. When they got the 95% efficacy, they were thrilled. Now, you also have heard a little bit about AstraZeneca. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular vaccine because it has not reached emergency use authorization, but it will probably in the coming weeks. And this too showed about a 90% efficacy. So right now we have 3 very good vaccines that are either in use as of last week, in use as of this week for Moderna, or in January for AstraZeneca. So let's talk a little bit about the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Now, I mentioned it was very, very efficacious. Well, It was efficacious about 95%. It was efficacious across age groups at that level, across genders, across races, across ethnicities, across countries, across people at risk, people at no risk, depending on your age, whether you had risk or not, it was effective. If you were obese or not, it was effective. It didn't matter. This vaccine efficacy was very, very good across all domains. And in fact, we talk about 2 doses, but they were thrilled at this amazing slide. Even after 1 dose, the blue is the vaccine group, somewhere around day 12, you start to see a dramatic decrease in the number of infections in those that receive the vaccine. And so when they took a closer look at this, what they saw was around day 10, even after 1 dose, efficacy was very, very good. Of course, it is best after 2 doses at that 95%, but even after 1 dose, we're going to start impacting this pandemic. Now, I don't want to leave Moderna out of this because this just got approved this weekend, so I'm going to go through this quickly. A question people might have is these studies, were they diverse enough? Did they include people like me? Did they include people like you? Well, this is the diversity, and this is where Operation Warp Speed helped. This shows that it include a very diverse population that was very reflective of the US population in general. It also was really reflective of the people on this call, healthcare workers, educational workers, emergency response. They really did a good job in making sure this phase 3 trial really give us a good quality evidence. So what happened with Moderna? Well, same type of thing. Very, very efficacious across age groups without comorbidities, with comorbidities, gender, race, it doesn't matter. It was very, very effective. And in fact, in the Moderna vaccine trial, they showed not only was it effective at preventing symptomatic disease, it was very, very effective at preventing severe disease. So this was a secondary endpoint. They had 30 people that had severe COVID in the placebo group and 0 who received the vaccine. Moderna also showed great efficacy even after 1 dose. And so what you can see here is the efficacy even starts after 1. Now it's time for safety. We're going to do our safety dance and talk a little bit about safety. So vaccine safety is a priority. Vaccine adverse events, after decades and decades and decades of vaccine research. Remember, we've been dealing with vaccines for generations. Vaccines are not new. We know that adverse events usually occur within the first 6 weeks of administration. And so one of the priorities was they needed to monitor both phase 3 trials, Moderna and Pfizer, for a minimum of 2 months. And this actually became a little bit of a question with the FDA, given political pressures that were evolving in November. Was the FDA going to hold, was going to stand to their protocols, or under political pressures, were they going to reveal information early? And they got a lot of applause because they refused to deviate from the standard safety protocols and refused to deviate from that. And so the protocols that were used were similar to other vaccine approval process. There was no deviation from the protocols, and there were no serious safety events in these vaccines. And so vaccine safety doesn't just end with these phase 3 trials. We have ongoing robust vaccine safety monitoring systems that will exist with this vaccine and with all vaccines. We have the vaccine adverse reporting system, vaccine safety data link. We will get a new vSafe. You'll get an app where you can monitor your vaccine safety. And so the vaccine safety doesn't just end, it will continue on for 2 years. So when we talk about vaccine safety, we do have to realize that it is hard to distinguish events that are true versus events that aren't true. So I expect over the next few weeks, few months, sometimes after the vaccine, some people will have heart attacks, some people will have strokes, some people will even die after the vaccine, However, some people will have snowstorms after the vaccine. Some people will win the lottery after the vaccine, and some people will get marriage proposals. And so what's very important as we deal with the media and the social media is temporal association is not causation. And so the serious adverse events are going to be monitored, but we can't get caught up in these temporal associations. So some things will happen after vaccines, but most will not be related to the vaccines. I'm hoping I'll be one of the lottery winners. So vaccine adverse effects, when do they occur? Well, when we talk about vaccines in general, you can get a vaccine adverse event from a live vaccine. Now, this is not a live vaccine, but with the polio vaccine, we did realize that 1 in 2.6 million people could actually get polio from the live polio vaccine that we don't use anymore. But that is just one example of the type of adverse effects. You can get an allergic reaction to vaccines. About 1 in a million people get that from the flu. You can get side effects from the immune response. Now, this is your immune system responding to the vaccine. So pain, swelling, fever, fatigue, achiness. These aren't true side effects. This is what we're trying to get. We want your immune system to respond, but sometimes these are referred to as side effects. I generally refer to them as getting your money's worth. It means your immune system is responding. On rare occasions with vaccines, there's been unusual side effects in a vaccine for rotavirus in kids. There was something called an intussusception. It was extremely rare, and the vaccine benefits far outweighed the benefits. Can you get vaccine adverse effects from preservatives? Really has never been proven. And in these particular vaccines, there's actually no preservatives, so it's not even an issue. Occasionally, you'll get cross-reaction from your immune system. So in MMR, sometimes you'll get low platelets, and sometimes you get other cross-reactivity. And a good example is Guillain-Barré from a flu shot. About 1 in a million people can get Guillain-Barré from the flu vaccine, and sometimes people refer to this as a side effect. I actually like to put this in perspective because influenza gives you Guillain-Barré 17 in a million. So the vaccine actually makes it about 17 times less likely to occur, but sometimes this information gets distorted. So mRNA doesn't do much except infect these cells. It gets inside these cells and it makes these spike proteins. mRNA is a very unstable particle. It reacts locally and is gone within a matter of hours. So when I talk about vaccines, one of the things that triggers more side effects is the number of antigens. And I like to reflect on this slide because as we've improved with our vaccine technology, we've actually been able to decrease the number of antigens in vaccines, meaning we get more protection and less side effects. So in 1980, there were 7 diseases that were covered with vaccines and 15,096 antigens. And so we did have a little bit more side effects in 1980. For children, in 2017, we cover 16 diseases and we're down to 177 antigens. So vaccines today really are very effective with very little side effects. So what will happen with COVID-19? Well, we'll go to 17 diseases and 178 antigens, 1 more antigen. So again, this should be a very, very safe vaccine. So how desirable are the anticipated benefits? Large, because it'll stop this pandemic. How substantial are the undesirable side effects? Very, very small. And do the benefits outweigh the harm? Absolutely. So let's talk about the Pfizer vaccine. Now, I talked about how you can get pain, swelling, or redness. And what you can see here is the percentages of mild to moderate pain at the vaccine site in dose 1 or dose 2. This represents the systemic side effects from the Pfizer vaccine in people 16 to 55 and greater than 55 years of age. And so what you see here is some of the side effects from the Pfizer vaccine can be fatigue, can be fever, fatigue, headache, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, and chills and joint pain. And so What's important to recognize here is the placebo had about 33% of the people developing fatigue after the vaccine. So what that tells me is there's just a lot of people that are generally fatigued out there. But there were slightly more side effects in the vaccine group, but it's a little bit more fatigue, maybe a little bit of headache, nothing you can't really deal with, a little bit of Tylenol or Motrin. What you don't see is a lot of severe or grade 4 vaccines. And so really, really well tolerated. In fact, I had my first vaccine just last week, and I really felt fine after the vaccine, had no real significant side effects, maybe a little pain at the injection site. Well, it's not completely true. The day after the vaccine, I woke up, I told my wife she looked beautiful. I made her coffee and I brought it to her in bed, and then I did the dishes. I actually think that side effect will pass within days, but my wife has asked me to get the vaccine every day for the next month, and we'll see how that goes. So this is the systemic side effects from the second dose. And the second dose is a little bit more reactogenic because you already have an immune system. And what you can see is slightly more side effects, a little bit more fever, low grade, a little bit more fatigue, but nothing you can't deal with a little Tylenol or Motrin. Now, for some of you that don't like graphs and like numbers, there's always the number person on here. Here's the percentage of people that had redness, swelling, or pain. Here's the greater than 55 group. This is a systemic reaction, people that really had a fever. We're talking about 1%, fatigue, severe, 1%, 1.4, headache, 1%. So very, very limited side effects from this vaccine. What day do the side effects occur? Usually between day 1 and 3, mostly on day 2, as you can see in this graph. And how about serious side effects? Actually, no significant difference between the vaccine group and the placebo. What you can see is similar numbers across the board. So what about Moderna? Similar side effects, similar with pain, similar with fatigue, headache, very, very mild side effects. The second vaccine, slightly more fatigue, maybe a little bit more fever, but generally well tolerated. This represents whether anybody had any significant adverse events. This is the vaccine group, this is the placebo. What you see are similar numbers across the board. They had a very large population during the middle of COVID, lots of people with comorbidities. So 6 people in the vaccine group did pass away, but 7 in the placebo passed away. This is just the normal process that occurs in routine society. Some people might ask, what's going to happen if I get the vaccine and have to go to work? Because they say I can't go to work without a fever. I want to reassure you that the CDC has a protocol in place so that we don't necessarily have to exclude you from work if you were to get one of those low-grade fevers. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. It's on the CDC website. So overall conclusion about safety is that the vaccine is very, very safe, and there's nothing more than mild to moderate normal reactions after the vaccine, the type that you want, that means you're getting an immune response. So what's the plan? The vaccine consists of 2 doses. It's given intramuscularly. The Pfizer vaccine is given 21 days apart, and the Moderna is given 28 days apart. There's a 4-day grace period. That being said, if you go in too early, if you go in too late, it doesn't matter as long as you get the second dose. That's what's important. Ideally, you get it between 17 and 21 days for Pfizer or 24 to 28 days for Moderna. That's the goal. Can you use one vaccine product with another? No, you want to stick with the same one. So if you start with Pfizer, get Pfizer as the second dose. If you start with Moderna, get Moderna as the second dose. They're generally not interchangeable. However, if somebody has an accident, the thought is we don't do anything about it. How about co-administration with vaccines? I do think this is important. At this point, what we're recommending, or the CDC is recommending, is you shouldn't receive another vaccine within 14 days of this one. This would be probably most significant with flu What's the issue is, in general, there is no issues with these types of vaccinations with co-administration. The co-administration only impacts live vaccines, but as a precaution, they're just trying to be cautious. Why not wait that 14-day period? However, they also say if it's accidentally done, don't worry about it. How about if you've had COVID, can you still get the vaccine? Absolutely, you can still get the vaccine if you've had COVID, and it should boost your immune system. Now, sometimes when we prioritize who gets it, since we know people who had COVID have this period of protection and they're not at risk, we're trying to put those lower on the priority list, but people with COVID in the past should get the vaccine. How about people who are currently infected with COVID? Well, we probably want you to defer mainly so that you don't infect your vaccine giver. How about people who've received antibody? I talked about passive antibody early in this talk, and currently the thought is because that antibody could interfere with the immune response, that if you got a COVID-19 antibody as treatment for a SARS infection, you should wait for 90 days before you're getting your vaccine. But that being said, we talked about how you're probably protected for that 90-day period anyways. How about a person who is under quarantine? Again, we're trying not to expose people, the vaccinators, but technically if you're a resident of a congregate healthcare setting like a long-term care facility, you can get vaccinated. How about people with underlying medical conditions? Absolutely, can get vaccinated. How about this one? Immunocompromised. This one is a challenging one. This was not studied in the trials, but what we do know is people who are immunocompromised are at high risk from COVID. And what we do know is that the mRNA vaccines are effective or should be effective for most immunocompromised people. And so the individual who's immunocompromised should discuss with their physician, but these individuals may still receive COVID vaccine unless their provider or have another contraindication. And so COVID vaccines are being encouraged. So how about pregnant women? This came up, and pregnant women were not studied, but the evidence would suggest that it is safe and effective in pregnancy, and pregnant women are high risk for COVID. How about breastfeeding or lactating women? Again, no specific safety data, but mRNA vaccines generally don't go through the breast milk, so there's really no concern. And in fact, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology recommends that the COVID vaccine should not be withheld from pregnant individuals or those who are lactating. People should be discussed about how you may have fever or aches. You can take an antipyretic like Motrin or Tylenol if you get those, but you shouldn't routinely be taking those before you get your vaccine, because in theory, some people feel that could interfere with your immune response. How about contraindications to the vaccine? Well, if you've had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine previously, you probably shouldn't get it. Or if you're allergic to one of these ingredients, again, not likely because these are generally fairly rare. Other precautions, if you've had a severe history of severe allergic reaction to other vaccines or injectables, you can still get it, but we want to observe you for 30 minutes after the vaccine. Other allergies do not constitute a contradiction or a precaution to vaccination. We will monitor people for 15 minutes in general, and if you're high risk, 30 minutes. This lists all the precautions and contraindications. Now, a lot of you have heard about the storage issues. This is something mainly for the hospital systems, but in general, the Pfizer is a little bit more challenging because of its storage requirements. This is Colorado's plan as of yesterday. We'll see if it changes, but we're talking today to people in 1A and 1B, but this is evolving with time. And so we need your help to get the word out. The vaccines will protect you, they'll protect your family, they'll protect your coworkers, and they'll protect your community. So we want you to strongly recommend this vaccine. We want you to give your friends, your colleagues good information so that they're comfortable. And our goal is so that we eventually have lines like this. Now, most of you probably don't know what this line is, but what seems like a new situation is not all that new, because this was the headline about 75 years ago when the polio vaccine came out. Similar headlines. What we want to be is having those lines for the COVID vaccine. So I'll end there and want to open it up for questions or discussion. I'm happy to take the questions. I think Stacy's been monitoring the chat. If people have questions, please put them in. I'm always available. My goal is to be a resource for the community. If you have questions, I want people to reach out, because our way out of this is here and we can do it. So thank you. I appreciate it, and we'll open it up for questions.
Dr. Brooks, we have our first question through the chat. Can you speak to the information so far about the likelihood of people who have received both rounds of vaccinations still being able to pass on or infect others with COVID?
Great question, Katie. As I talked about, the endpoint was symptomatic COVID, and they didn't specifically look for asymptomatic infection. Now, in the Moderna study, they actually did do a little bit of this, and they showed after one vaccine, there was a 70% reduction in getting asymptomatic infection. So at this point, those who receive vaccine will still be asked to wear their mask and socially distance, so that we don't inadvertently get an asymptomatic infection and spread it to a vulnerable population. But I expect and hope that more information will be available soon that will support that early Moderna information that shows that it likely prevents asymptomatic infection.
Great, thank you. Another question. I have received some questions from staff regarding of those who have a history of severe allergic reactions. Do we have U.S. guidance on what to do with these staff members so far?
So if they've had a severe allergic reaction to the first previous COVID vaccine, that's a contraindication. Or if they have a known anaphylaxis to one of the ingredients, all very rare. The one that you probably want to look at is the polyethylene glycol, because that's the one that likely triggers allergic reactions. If you have a history of severe allergic reaction to another vaccine or another injectable, you can still get the vaccine, but the administrative team needs to have needs to be prepared and have anaphylaxis materials on hand, and those individuals need to be monitored for 30 minutes after vaccine administration, but you should still proceed with vaccines to those groups.
Great. Any word on when children will be able to receive the vaccine?
Yeah. So children are going to be later in the process. Pfizer is now, and Moderna are now studying down to age 12. Nobody's studying below that at this point. They plan to expand the information to children later in the year, and we anticipate children will likely become eligible probably later this year or a year from now. One of the thought processes on why they purposely waited for children is children have a much lower severity of disease. And so their risk of COVID, which was much less, and they wanted to have the ability to have a longer period of observation for these children. And so we expect that those under 12 will likely be a year out, but possibly this summer or later this fall for 12 and older.
Great. Does the vaccine cause infertility?
You know, that's before the vaccine even came out, someone showed me a social media post about this specific question, and I know it's been making its rounds, but there's no evidence of any association between infertility and this vaccine. And in fact, there's really not a lot of evidence of a single antibody causing infertility across the board. Certainly there's complex autoimmune diseases that can contribute, but there is no evidence of infertility. I'm sorry that this has been making the rounds, but in the studies, there was no evidence of this.
Has the 1B designation been expanded to include teachers? The graphic shared a few minutes ago says that teachers, school staff, are in phase 2.
So that's a great question. And this information comes quick. Just yesterday, the ACIP expanded their definition. And so they're the CDC, and they expanded their definition just yesterday to include essential workers that are critical to societal function. And I know they included teachers in that group. And so the CDC has this group called 1B. The state of Colorado has their 3 phases, and it'll be very interesting to see what changes the state of Colorado makes. And I keep checking the website all this morning because I knew this question would come up to see if they make any changes. So I can't actually say what changes will occur in the state of Colorado because I don't make that decision and it has not occurred yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if it does occur because the ACIP and the CDC changed it just yesterday.
Great. So being a 1B entity, how will our office staff go about getting our initial doses and when?
Well, and so everything is changing fast. It changes fast. We have meetings like every day and in the afternoon. So for this week, and so I can only tell you this week, okay? Next week will be different. For this week, the process has already been determined by Garfield Public Health, and the 2 hospital systems are receiving their vaccine allocations hopefully later in the week. And those people in the high-risk categories have been sent notification from Garfield Public Health, and the goal is to get them vaccinated this week. How that'll change next week, I don't know. We'll have to see.
All right, can you explain why the vaccine will create longer immunity compared to giving COVID itself?
Yeah, Karen, great question. You know, I actually don't know the answer to that. We don't know how long immunity lasts with COVID, and we don't really know how long immunity will last with this vaccine. And so it is possible that we may need to have booster doses of this vaccine similar to what we do with flu. So it is possible that our immunity will wane with time and we'll need to get booster doses similar to other vaccines. Now, a little bit of what we do know about coronaviruses is there are lots of coronaviruses. There are actually 4 common coronaviruses that we've been dealing with all our lives that just cause simple colds, sometimes a little bit more. And what we know from those coronaviruses is that immunity generally lasts about a year and you become more susceptible after a year. Now, it's possible that even though we become more susceptible, maybe disease severity will be less with COVID if we get it again because of immunologic memory, but we don't really know how long the vaccine will last. What we know at this time is it lasts it's very effective for 2 to 3 months, but we expect it to be longer, but I won't be surprised if we won't have to get boosters at some point.
Great, thank you. If a person is vaccinated and later is exposed to a person who is COVID positive, would they still need to quarantine for 14 days?
At this point, the recommendation from CDPHE and CDC remains that need to quarantine because we haven't conclusively proven that the vaccine prevents asymptomatic infection. Meaning, if you were exposed, could you still get an infection that you had no symptoms and still spread it around to the community? So at this point, the quarantine parameters are still in effect. We hope that with more data that will change because that certainly would make life a lot easier for people.
All right, Dr. Brooks, it looks like you have handled all of the questions in the Q&A as well as in the chat. Any final closing remarks? And then we will sign off exactly at 1 o'clock.
You know, I really just want to emphasize that everybody on this call has a role. You're on this call as a professional, and whether you're police or fire or teachers or a healthcare provider, with that role becomes a level of credibility. And that level of credibility can do amazing things for our community. And so we want you to feel comfortable with this vaccine. But after that, I really want you to go out and promote how important this is to get us back to our lives, to being with our families, to being with our friends. I can't wait for that day to occur, and this is the beginning to the end with your help. So I appreciate everybody's participation. We appreciate the collaboration, and I, as usual, always want to make myself available. If anybody has any questions after this, feel free to reach out to the hospital through email or other means and give me a call or email me, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So I appreciate it, and thank you for what you've done to keep our community safe during this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.